His father was dead. His mother was dead. His wife was dead. His sister, his daughter, his niece, all dead. Every member of his immediate family gone in the same US-Israeli airstrike that started this war 10 days ago. The man who inherited this loss, Mojtaba Khamenei, had been supreme leader for less than 24 hours. His first act was not a speech to the people of Iran. It was a message sent by missile, projectiles arcing through the air, aimed directly at Israel. The target was not a military base. It was a civilian air raid shelter, a place designed for safety, and the world was about to find out if that design would hold. It did not. Near Jerusalem, in the city of Beit Shemesh, the missile found its target. Not a military base, not an infrastructure hub, a public bomb shelter. Concrete walls, low ceiling, the buzz of fluorescent tubes. People on plastic chairs, checking their phones, murmuring, shushing a restless child. A room you only enter under stress, but which the state had spent years teaching you to trust. The strike was direct. A single concussion blew out the lights, shattered concrete, and drove dust into lungs. It killed 9 civilians. 9 people who died in the one place they had been told explicitly was safe. Every parent watching had to redraw the map in their head. If the shelter can be hit, where do you send your kids on the next siren? The psychological contract between the state and its people, a promise of security held for decades, didn't shatter as a slogan. It broke in that private recalculation of risk in living rooms across the country. That moment wasn't a statistical fluke or a random technical failure. It was the first receipt delivered for a debt of blood, a consequence engineered by one man, Mojtaba Khamenei, from a bunker hundreds of miles away. The strike achieved exactly what he designed it to do, prove that the shield was an illusion. Beit Shemesh was not a freak hole in an otherwise solid wall. Images from the front lines showed the same pattern of exposure. Israeli soldiers, the protectors themselves, were photographed huddled in open drainage ditches, taking cover where water was meant to run, not men. Their own military bunkers were inadequate, overcrowded, outdated, built for a different scale and precision of fire than the one now aimed at them. The narrative of an impenetrable defense system had met the physical reality of decaying concrete and insufficient cover. The gap between the story and the outcome was now measured in lives. The myth of a flawless physical shield was finished. What failed was the core guarantee that if you reached the designated safe space, the public shelter, the military position, you were protected. That is a problem of engineering and investment, ugly and expensive, but in theory, fixable. When a hard shield fails in public view, the softer shields get repriced. Governments and capital markets are built on a different kind of protection. A shield made of promises, of alliances, of perceived reliability, and, with Israel's core promise of security now broken in plain sight, the question became, what is that second shield worth? The answer to what the second shield was worth arrived quickly, not in a war room, but in Gulf cabinet rooms and royal courts, where ministers traced coastlines and asked one question: when Washington rotates its forces somewhere else, who still lives across the water from Iran? The shockwaves from the attack on Israel tested the US-led regional alliance, and the first crack appeared in Doha. Despite his own country's territory being hit by stray shrapnel, Qatar's Prime Minister, Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani, went public. He filed a formal protest with Iran and on social media warned his neighbours in plain language, do not get involved. This was not betrayal of an ally, it was survival math. On one side of the ledger sat a temporary American objective, measured in election cycles and news cycles. On the other sat Iran's geography as a neighbor, with decades of grievance and a record of retaliation. Statements and silences from other Gulf capitals echoed the same posture. This is not our war. For the small, wealthy Gulf states, the conclusion was simple. They lack the strategic depth, the cities, the terrain, the tolerance for pain, to absorb decades of Iranian payback once US forces thin out. In their own language, it was a business decision. Protect enduring assets by staying out of a fight that would leave them exposed long after the American deployment has moved on. That logic produced a split screen that was absurd on its face. On the tarmac at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, the largest US base in the Middle East, jets spooled up for war. Inside the same country, the Prime Minister's warning, "Do not get involved," stayed pinned on phones. The United States was preparing to fight from a host that had openly refused to fight alongside it. That was the second cascading failure. The gap between the narrative of a steadfast alliance and the reality of strategic isolation. While diplomats drafted statements and generals refined options, something else moved first. Capital doesn't wait for press conferences. It reads that split screen as risk and reprices it. That repricing shows up where you actually live, in the value of your portfolio, the multiple on your business, the cost of borrowing against your assets. As that second shield fractures in markets, deliver a brutal assessment of what it was worth. That brutal assessment was not theoretical. It was immediate. While politicians were still arguing over blame, capital had already delivered its verdict and started to move. Capital doesn't wait for speeches to end. In Yemen, Iran's allies signaled their intent. Houthi leader Abdul Malik al-Houthi declared their finger is on the trigger, prepared to resume a blockade on the Red Sea. A vital global artery, responsible for an estimated $1 trillion in annual trade, was now a declared target. If that route is choked, ships reroute thousands of miles and insurance premia spike, pushing up costs, squeezing corporate margins, and fading into inflation and equity volatility. The Houthi threat forced anyone with serious money in the Gulf to redraw their risk map. The perception of the Gulf as a safe haven fractured. The Financial Times reported the super-rich in Dubai paying over $200,000 for private jets to flee via Oman. That wasn't simple panic. It was wealthy families paying a six-figure exit tax rather than risk being trapped as the conflict widened. That is a classic leading indicator. The moment the market quietly removes a region's stability premium. Anytime you see elite flight and sudden pricing gaps like that, you treat them as an early warning siren. Capital is doing the math before governments, and you adjust before the reassurances arrive. This geopolitical turmoil translated directly into portfolios. Two strategic choke points, the Red Sea and the Strait of Hormuz, sit on the main valves of global energy and trade. As markets priced the risk of those valves partially closing, oil and shipping costs jumped, and corporate input costs and inflation expectations were marked higher. Brent crude oil surged past $100 to $119 intraday. And across global markets, an estimated $6 trillion in value was erased in days. For a normally diversified investor, that didn't show up as an abstract headline. It showed up as broad index funds marked down, retirement accounts and pensions shrinking, and private business valuations being cut as public comparables reset lower. The spike in oil was not speculation. It was the market pricing in a prolonged, costly war with no clear off-ramp. A Morgan Stanley analysis confirmed the pattern. Higher oil inflation, equity headwinds, bond yields up. In other words, both sides of the standard 60-40 portfolio were hit at the same time. Stocks under pressure from earnings risk, and core bonds losing value as yields rose. Within that conventional public market toolkit, there were very few places to hide. And yet, as trillions in value vanished and capital fled, a different story was being broadcast from the world's capitals. One of control, calm, and resolve. A narrative completely disconnected from the reality reflected in oil, jets on the tarmac, and the red in your portfolio. That gap between the official story and the facts on the ground is where the next phase of this crisis will be shaped. That gap between the official story and the facts on the ground has a timestamp. A Florida fundraiser in the March 9-10, 2026 window. In a hotel ballroom, over donor chatter, President Trump projected absolute control. He described the war as a short-term excursion. He promised that coalition forces were, quote, crushing the enemy in an overwhelming display of technical skill and military force. The message in that room was clear. This was a problem being solved decisively. Freeze that picture. Because on those same days, anonymous US military officials were telling journalists at Reuters and the New York Times a completely different story. They admitted to being surprised by the scale and the persistence of Iran's retaliation. They confessed they were skeptical of any quick outcome. That isn't analysis. This is a direct contradiction. One narrative for the cameras, another for the record. The most damning part sits in the paperwork that came before the strike. As later reporting and oversight disclosures made clear, pre-strike CIA assessments had already warned the White House about what was likely to happen next. Those assessments said that replacing the supreme leader was far more likely to install hardliners than to cause a regime collapse. The intelligence was there, it was ignored, so the military's surprise was a fiction. This is the core dysfunction, a conflict being managed for a domestic political narrative, while on the ground there is no coherent strategy, no endgame. Allies watch that gap and quietly start hedging, reconsidering commitments, delaying decisions, looking for exits. Markets do the same thing in price. Risk premia widen. Volatility picks up. A capital steps back from anything tied to the theatre and hides in whatever still looks liquid and predictable. Because capital understands that reality is never, ever optional. This gap between the official story and the facts on the ground is a feature of modern crises. You've seen versions of it before in different countries. What disconnect between a public narrative and market reality is worrying you the most right now? Let me know in the comments, because once you see the pattern, you stop treating this as a communications glitch and start treating it as a risk signal. But this pattern, a confident public story masking a strategic void, is not an isolated incident. It is a script we have seen before, almost word for word. Last time, it ended with a US president calling a similar decision the single worst mistake of his presidency. That earlier disaster is not background noise here. It's the template for where this crisis is heading. That precedent was set in Libya 2011. President Obama was told Muammar Gaddafi was preparing a massacre in Benghazi, a moment that, on paper, carried stark moral clarity. He led a NATO air intervention. The mission delivered a clean short-term success. The massacre was averted, and Gaddafi was removed from power. The headlines in October of that year were celebratory. Libya was held up as the good intervention, civilians saved, no American body bags, a dictator gone. But the celebration was built on a structural void. There was no plan for the day after. Removing one man created a power vacuum that pulled the state apart. By 2014, those headlines were a distant memory. Libya had split into rival governments and militias. That fragmentation opened space for ISIS to move in and grab territory. In the ungoverned zones, human trafficking networks flourished. Open-air slave markets showed up in global news feeds, proof that state authority had collapsed. As the violence and economic ruin spread, a massive refugee crisis followed, pushing instability into Europe across the Mediterranean. The intervention, sold as a way to stabilize the region, also knocked out Libya's oil flows. Production swung from pre-war normals into repeated shutdowns and partial recoveries from 2011 through 2014. Each time exports went offline, traders marked in a higher risk premium, pushing up prices and volatility in global crude benchmarks. For Europe, that, combined with the refugee inflows, turned a clean intervention into energy insecurity and political strain. For anyone managing capital, this is what matters. A misdesigned war in North Africa did not stay over there. It showed up in fuel costs, in European political risk, and in the volatility priced into energy-heavy portfolios. This isn't just a critic's post-mortem. Years later, in a 2016 interview, Barack Obama was asked about his worst mistake. He answered, probably failing to plan, for the day after, what I think was the right thing to do in intervening in Libya. That is not an ideological confession. It's a sitting president acknowledging a design failure in the mission itself. That failure to plan for the day after is the blueprint for the Iran crisis you are watching now. A strike that removed Iran's supreme leader, taken with no clear end state, sold as a contained success while the underlying system starts to unravel. Libya shows the pattern. The victory narrative peaks as the real costs begin to compound. So Libya gives you the lesson. You plan for the consequences of your victory, or the system breaks. But the current war goes one level deeper. What if its architects didn't just skip the day after plan? What if the entire strategy rested on a premise so disconnected from ground reality that there was never a viable day after at all? The reason a day after was never even possible is because the failure wasn't the absence of a plan. The failure was the plan itself. Much of what followed, the escalation into open war, the alliance strain, the market shocks, tracks back to that first decision. Build a strategy on a false assumption, and every move that rests on it pushes the system the same way. Allies forced into binary choices, risk repriced higher, no credible off-ramp left. Inside Langley, that strategy was the CIA's foundational plan. On paper, it looked clean. Remove the supreme leader, let internal pressures do the rest, then step in later to manage a softer, more reasonable Iran. Beneath the briefings sat a string of optimistic assumptions that senior officials treated as articles of faith. Assumption 1. If the supreme leader were killed, ordinary Iranians would do the heavy lifting. Years of sanctions and repression, they argued, had primed the streets. Take out the symbol at the top, and the people would pour into the squares and finish the job. The reality on the ground was different. The day after the strike, the expected flashpoint stayed controlled. No flood of crowds, no cascading rallies, only checkpoints, state-organized mourning, and a population watching, wary, from behind closed doors. Assumption 2. The regime would fracture under the shock. Analysts carved Tehran's power structure into pragmatists and hardliners, and convinced themselves the former would seize the moment, cut a deal with the West, and sideline the ideologues. Instead, the opposite happened. Faced with an external killshot, the factions mapped as rivals closed ranks. Whatever disputes they had went indoors. And outwardly, the system presented a single, unyielding face. Assumption 3. From that turbulence, a more moderate, more negotiable supreme leader would surface. In the models, this successor would need Western support, crave sanctions relief, and sell de-escalation at home as national renewal. Instead, Iran got a new supreme leader whose biography ran the other way, shaped by war, loss, and decades inside the security state, with his legitimacy bound up in avenging his predecessor and proving the revolution had been hardened, not broken. Months later, an internal after-action review inside the agency tried to compress the failure into one line. Everything the plan assumed happened in reverse. That was the verdict after the fact. Later, Reuters reporting, based on interviews with US officials, made something harsher clear. They had been warned beforehand. Pre-strike CIA assessments, passed up the chain and briefed into the White House, had already concluded that killing the supreme leader would not trigger a popular uprising or regime collapse, but would most likely install an equally hardline successor. The warning travelled where it was supposed to go. Senior decision makers saw the data and chose to treat it as noise. That choice tells you everything about the operating style. There was no end-state planning, no mapped sequence for stabilizing a nuclear threshold state after a decapitation strike, no shared understanding with allies of what came next. Objectives were rewritten around whatever the last headline or battlefield report happened to be. One former official, looking back years later, reached for a musician's metaphor. He called it regime change by jazz improvisation. With that single miscalculation, a difficult but containable political problem was turned into something far more volatile. The killing did not dissolve the enemy. It personalized the conflict, fused it to one man's need for revenge, and locked the region, and the capital tied to it, into a war with a clear entrance and no believable exit. Next, we'll map what that permanent reality means for anyone still assuming they can trade this away or diversify around it. The trap is set. The assassination, sold as a clean way to weaken the regime, did the opposite. You don't get collapse. You get consolidation. The rally around the flag, effect that planners treated as a footnote, has done the heavy lifting. Hardliners are now locked in. The bureaucracy is aligned, and the vacuum they were counting on has been filled by a man on a personal mission, not a negotiator. Across regional security circles and the small group of Iran watchers who have tracked Mojtaba for years, the description is blunt. His father on steroids. The same ideology, but welded to a biographical wound we've already walked through in this series. The family losses that turned politics into a ledger of personal debt. That is the hinge. You have replaced a political operator whose currency was leverage with a successor whose primary currency is revenge. With that kind of leader, there is no believable diplomatic off-ramp to model. You can't bargain down a score that in his mind can only be settled in blood. Once a war loses its off-ramp, markets lose their timeline. Instead of pricing a spike and a ceasefire, they are forced to price a grinding, open-ended campaign. For anyone running capital on a multi-year view, that is the real trap. The assumptions that underpinned your risk framework, the idea that Gulf flare-ups would mean revert within quarters, that great power guarantees would cap escalation, that theatres of conflict would stay partially uncorrelated, no longer hold. We have already seen how every round of missiles and sabotage along the Gulf shipping lanes we mapped earlier forced insurers, shippers and energy traders to reprice risk in days, not years. That isn't a one-off shock. It's the template. So, for the investor, For anyone building for the long term, this is the ultimate stress test. Not a policy dispute. You can hedge with a calendar, but a conflict driven by a pain that has no price. It pushes duration risk out beyond normal cycles. It keeps a permanent risk premium embedded in supply routes and regional assets. And it turns what used to be diversifiable geopolitical risk into a semi-permanent background condition. The optimistic speeches about a limited, stabilizing strike have faded. Look at the physical outcome we are actually left with. The disrupted routes we charted, the tankers forced into detours, the infrastructure that does not get rebuilt because no one believes the threat is over. That is the gap between narrative and outcome. The promise of quick containment on one side, and a built-in incentive for low-level, perpetual conflict on the other. History does not judge wars by the speeches given while they are being fought. History judges them by the outcomes that follow, and history does not grade on a curve. The outcome here is simple and brutal. A more dangerous world, a conflict with no foreseeable end, and a risk structure that refuses to go back inside the old models. If you want this kind of causal map before the headlines move your portfolio, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't see the next fracture after it has already hit your numbers.